What if the people who are least suited to lead are precisely the ones most likely to attain leadership positions? Imagine walking into a boardroom or government chamber and realizing that the person with the most power is the one who perhaps deserves it the least. Could our social systems be fundamentally flawed in how they select leaders? Look around you. In politics, business, and institutions around the world, we see the same pattern repeating. Look at Richard Nixon, who reached the pinnacle of American power only to abuse it during the Watergate scandal. Despite his intelligence and experience, Nixon's paranoia, deception, and moral compromises led to his downfall. Yet these same traits, his ruthless pragmatism and willingness to bend rules, helped him climb the political ladder in the first place. Nearly 500 years ago, Niccolò Machiavelli observed this same pattern in Renaissance Italy. In his controversial masterpiece, The Prince, he wrote, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few really know what you are." In other words, appearance trumps reality when it comes to leadership. Machiavelli wasn't advocating for deception. He was describing an uncomfortable truth about human psychology and power dynamics that modern research has confirmed. Research in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that overconfident individuals are often perceived as more competent, even when their actual abilities don't justify this perception. Today, we're going to explore why our leadership systems consistently reward traits that should disqualify candidates: narcissism, dishonesty, and even foolishness. We'll examine how Machiavelli's insights from the 16th century align with what psychological research now confirms about human behavior and power structures. But we'll also look at exceptions, leaders and organizations that have managed to break this pattern, and what we can learn from them. The prince must consider how to avoid those things which make him hated or contemptible. It makes him contemptible to be considered fickle, frivolous, effeminate, mean-spirited, irresolute, from all of which a prince should guard himself as from a rock. When Machiavelli wrote these words, he was acknowledging something profound about leadership positions. They reward those who project unwavering confidence and decisiveness. In contemporary terms, this means narcissistic individuals often have a significant advantage in leadership competitions. Think of it like this. Imagine you're lost in the woods with a group of strangers. Two people step forward offering to lead. One says, "I think I know the way, but I'm not entirely sure. There are several possible paths we could take." The other declares, "I know exactly where to go. Follow me without question." Even though the first person's being honest about the uncertainty which exists for anyone in unfamiliar terrain, most groups will follow the second person. Have you noticed this pattern play out in your own workplace or community? That instant gravitation towards certainty, even when uncertainty might be more honest? A comprehensive meta-analysis published in Personnel Psychology examined 54 studies on the relationship between narcissism and leadership. The traits that help narcissists get selected for leadership roles, supreme confidence, charismatic self-presentation, and bold visions, aren't necessarily the same traits that make for effective leadership once selected. In fact, companies led by narcissistic CEOs experience 27% more volatility in performance and are 33% more likely to face negative market reactions to their strategic decisions. Consider former WeWork CEO Adam Neumann, who convinced investors to value his office sharing startup at $47 billion despite massive losses. His grandiose vision and unwavering self-confidence helped him raise billions while presenting himself as a world-changing visionary. But these same traits eventually contributed to his company's dramatic downfall, with WeWork's valuation plummeting by more than 80% when reality couldn't match his grandiose promises. The psychology behind this phenomenon is straightforward. We're naturally drawn to confidence, especially in uncertain situations. Research shows that individuals displaying confidence, even when wrong, gain higher social status than those expressing uncertainty. As one psychologist put it, we prefer confidence to accuracy. Machiavelli recognized this when he noted that nothing makes a prince so much esteemed as great enterprises and setting a fine example. The appearance of greatness often matters more than actual competence. Yet there are notable exceptions to this pattern. Consider former Botswana President Cyrus Khama, who led his country from one of Africa's poorest nations to one of its most stable and prosperous democracies. Unlike many post-colonial African leaders who cultivated personality cults, Khama governed with humility and pragmatism, establishing strong institutions rather than consolidating personal power. Under his leadership, Botswana's GDP grew from $69 million in 1966 to over $8.4 billion by 2000, while life expectancy increased from 52 to 65 years. His leadership demonstrates that while narcissism might provide advantages in attaining power, steadiness, integrity, and genuine concern for citizen welfare can create more lasting leadership legacies. When you reflect on leaders who've truly transformed their organizations or communities, have you noticed this distinction between the traits that help someone gain power versus those that help them use it effectively? Everyone admits how praiseworthy it is in a prince to keep his word and to behave with integrity rather than cunning. Nevertheless, our experience has been that those princes who have done great things have considered keeping their word of little account and have known how to beguile men's minds by shrewdness and cunning. This is perhaps Machiavelli's most infamous observation, that successful leaders often employ deception. Modern readers are often shocked by his apparent endorsement of lying, but Machiavelli wasn't advocating for dishonesty as a moral good. Rather, he was making an empirical observation about what tactics tend to succeed in power struggles. Effective deception in leadership isn't usually about blatant lies. Instead, it works more like a magician's misdirection. Imagine watching a card trick. While you're focused on the magician's right hand waving dramatically, his left hand is quietly doing the real work. Political and corporate leaders use similar tactics, drawing attention to favorable metrics while quietly hiding unfavorable ones. When you think about leaders you've encountered, how often have they directed your attention to what they want you to see rather than what you need to see? The psychology behind why this works is fascinating. Humans suffer from what behavioral economists call optimism bias. We tend to interpret ambiguous information in ways that align with our hopes. It's like wearing rose-colored glasses. We naturally filter information to support what we want to believe. Leaders who understand this can craft messages that different constituents interpret according to their own preferences. Consider how corporate communications often work. Losses become strategic investments, while modest achievements are framed as breakthrough successes. Research from the University of Michigan shows that leaders who frame company challenges positively often boost employee morale and productivity by 31%, even when the situation is objectively difficult. Machiavelli captured this dynamic perfectly when he observed that in the actions of all men, especially of princes, where there is no court to appeal to, one looks to the end. So let a prince win and maintain his state. The means will always be judged honorable and will be praised by everyone. But not all organizations operate this way. Patagonia, under founder Yvon Chouinard's leadership, built its brand on radical transparency, openly acknowledging the environmental impact of its products and actively discouraging unnecessary consumption with campaigns like "Don't buy this jacket." This counterintuitive honesty didn't hurt the company. It strengthened customer loyalty and built an authentic brand identity that competitors struggled to match. In fact, During this period of radical transparency, Patagonia's revenue grew from $295 million to $1.5 billion, while customer loyalty metrics exceeded industry standards by 38%. The most dangerous deception isn't what leaders tell their followers, but what they tell themselves. A 2023 study in organizational behavior and human decision processes found that power increases self-deception by 42%. Leaders become increasingly convinced of their own narratives, even when evidence contradicts them. This creates a disturbing feedback loop, where leaders who believe their own myths become more convincing to others, which reinforces their power and further enhances their self-deception. The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Machiavelli's insight here reveals something surprising. Truly intelligent leaders surround themselves with other intelligent people, while insecure leaders surround themselves with fools. But this creates a paradox in leadership selection. Leaders who appear intellectually simple can sometimes gain advantages that more thoughtful leaders cannot. Think of this as the beer test in politics. The idea that voters often prefer candidates they'd enjoy having a beer with over those who appear too intellectual or complex. This isn't just anecdotal, it's grounded in psychology. Social scientists call it the pratfall effect, the phenomenon where highly competent individuals who show minor weaknesses or simplicity become more relatable and likable than those who appear flawless or intellectual. When you think about leaders who've risen rapidly in your field, are they the most thoughtful, nuanced thinkers, or those who offer simple, decisive answers with unwavering confidence? Have you noticed how we often mistake simplicity for clarity? George W. Bush's folksy communication style during his presidency provides an interesting example. Despite graduating from Yale and Harvard Business School, he deliberately adopted a simpler communication style that connected with many voters who might have found a more intellectual presentation alienating. The psychology behind this phenomenon is revealing. Humans have an innate discomfort with ambiguity and the complexity. We crave certainty, even when certainty isn't possible. Leaders who offer simple narratives and clear answers tap into this psychological need, even when complex problems demand nuanced solutions. A Stanford study of 952 CEOs found that leaders who communicated in simpler language were 23% more likely to be hired and given 16% higher initial compensation packages. However, they were also 31% more likely to underperform in complex business environments where nuanced thinking was required. Machiavelli understood this when he advised, "A prince ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study than war and its rules and discipline, for this is the sole art that belongs to him who rules." This isn't just about military matters. It's about focusing on what appears most practical and straightforward, rather than abstract or theoretical considerations. This creates what we might call the complexity trap in leadership. Those most capable of navigating the actual complexities of leadership are often least likely to be selected for leadership positions because their acknowledgement of complexity makes them appear less decisive and confident than their simpler competitors. It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. This famous Machiavellian quote captures a profound paradox about leadership psychology. Empathy and traditional virtues, while morally admirable, can sometimes become strategic liabilities in leadership contexts. Machiavelli wasn't suggesting leaders should be cruel. He explicitly warned against behaviors that generate hatred. Rather, he was acknowledging that excessive empathy can prevent leaders from making necessary but difficult decisions. Modern psychological research supports this observation. A study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that individuals in positions of power showed reduced mirror neuronal activity, the brain's empathy mechanism, when observing others in distress. The researchers concluded that reduced empathy might be an adaptation that helps people make difficult leadership decisions. Think of it as similar to a surgeon's detachment. If a surgeon felt the full emotional impact of cutting into another human being, they might be unable to perform life-saving operations. Similarly, leaders often need to make decisions that cause short-term pain for long-term gain. Those who feel others' pain too acutely may hesitate when decisive action is needed. Does this resonate with difficult decisions you've had to make where too much empathy might have prevented necessary action? This creates a troubling dynamic in leadership selection. People with naturally lower empathy, including those with narcissistic traits, may find it easier to project the decisiveness and emotional stability we associate with leadership. A University of California study found that individuals scoring higher on narcissism measures were 35% more likely to be selected as group leaders in experimental settings. Machiavelli recognized this when he wrote, "Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived." Leaders with a reduced empathy are often more willing to use deception because they're less troubled by its effects on others. This connects directly to how virtues function in leadership contexts. Machiavelli observed, "Thus it is well to seem merciful, faithful, humane, religious, upright, and to be so, but with a mind so framed that should you require not to be so, you may be able and know how to change to the opposite." This counterintuitive insight highlights one of the strangest paradoxes in leadership psychology. Sometimes traditional virtues like honesty, humility, and kindness can produce worse outcomes than their opposites. This isn't because virtues are bad, but because their effectiveness depends entirely on context. Consider how former German Chancellor Angela Merkel navigated the European refugee crisis. Her decision to accept over 1 million refugees in 2015 required balancing humanitarian empathy with pragmatic concerns about integration and public opinion. Had she been either purely empathetic or entirely pragmatic, the outcome would likely have been worse for all involved. The wisdom lay in knowing when to lead with compassion and when to impose practical limits. But there are alternatives to this cynical view. The servant leadership model, developed by Robert Greenleaf in the 1970s, suggests that leaders who prioritize their followers' needs over their own ambitions often produce better long-term organizational outcomes. Costco provides a compelling example. Under CEO Jim Sinegal's leadership, Costco paid wages 40% above industry average and provided health care to 85% of employees when competitors covered only 47%. The results speak for themselves. Costco's employee turnover is just 17% compared to the 44% industry average. And during Sinegal's tenure, Costco's stock outperformed Walmart by 300%. The real challenge isn't choosing between virtue and effectiveness, but developing the wisdom to know which virtues serve the greater good in each specific context. As Aristotle, whom Machiavelli had surely read, argued, virtue isn't about following rigid rules, but applying principles appropriately to each unique situation. For there is such a difference between how one lives and how one ought to live, that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. This observation from Machiavelli captures the fundamental problem with leadership selection. The attributes that help someone win a leadership competition are often different from, and sometimes opposed to, the attributes that make for effective leadership once selected. Think of it like casting an actor to play a doctor in a movie versus hiring an actual doctor for a hospital. The actor who looks most like our mental image of a doctor, tall, authoritative, with perfect hair and teeth, might win the movie role, but would be useless in an operating room. Similarly, candidates who perform leadership most convincingly often win leadership positions over those who would exercise leadership most effectively. How often have you seen the most qualified person lose out to the most impressive performer? Modern research confirms this pattern. Studies show that individuals with narcissistic traits are more likely to emerge as leaders in group settings. But these same traits often lead to poor leadership outcomes once in position. This creates what researchers call the leadership paradox. The attributes that help someone rise to power can make them poor stewards of that power. The psychology behind this paradox reveals our evolutionary heritage. Studies suggest that humans evolved to be sensitive to signals of dominance and confidence when selecting leaders, particularly in threatening environments. This made sense in ancestral contexts where physical protection was a primary concern, but creates problems in modern organizational settings where collaboration and innovation matter more. Research from the University of California shows that our leadership selection criteria remain remarkably similar to those used by chimpanzees. We instinctively prefer individuals who display confidence, height, vocal power, and social dominance. These traits have minimal correlation with effective modern leadership capabilities. Machiavelli recognized this fundamental tension when he wrote, "The people are the masses. The nobility are the leadership class who wish to rule over the people. The people have one simple desire, not to be dominated or oppressed by the powerful. The nobility merely want to dominate and oppress the people." This creates a troubling cycle. Our leadership selection systems might be systematically choosing precisely the wrong types of people for leadership roles. Those most eager to lead are often those least suited to do so wisely, while those who would lead most effectively are often reluctant to pursue power. Consider Nelson Mandela, who became South Africa's president not through power-seeking but through moral authority earned during 27 years of imprisonment. His leadership approach, emphasizing reconciliation over retribution, demonstrates how leaders who don't fit the Machiavellian mold can create transformational change. Similarly, Abraham Lincoln was initially dismissed as awkward and unpolished, yet his thoughtful, empathetic leadership style proved uniquely suited to navigate America through its greatest crisis. These exceptions to the pattern suggest that while our default leadership selection systems may favor narcissists and manipulators, alternative approaches are possible. Therefore, it is unnecessary for a prince to have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but it is very necessary to appear to have them. This famously cynical observation captures Machiavelli's pragmatic approach to leadership ethics, but it would be a mistake to read him as simply advocating deception. Rather, Machiavelli was acknowledging the psychological reality that perception often matters more than reality in leadership contexts, and challenging us to design better systems. If appearance often trumps a reality in leadership selection, how can we ensure that our leaders actually possess the qualities needed for effective leadership? The answer may lie in redesigning our selection systems to account for these psychological biases. Some ancient societies used fascinating approaches to this problem. The Venetian Republic used an elaborate system mixing election and random selection to choose its doge, leader, partly to prevent any faction from capturing power. Other societies required leaders to periodically relinquish control, preventing the psychological corruption that comes with extended power. Modern organizations are experimenting with similar innovations. Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund, implements what founder Ray Dalio calls radical transparency, a system where employees at all levels can critique leadership decisions, and where even the CEO's performance is regularly evaluated through anonymous feedback. This approach helps prevent the echo chambers that typically reinforce narcissistic leadership styles. Drawing from both Machiavellian wisdom and modern psychological research, there are several reforms organizations can adopt to protect themselves from manipulative or corrupt leadership. First, they should prioritize actual outcomes over interview performance. Studies show that past behavior is a much better predictor of future actions than how well someone performs in a high-stakes conversation. Next, instead of giving leaders permanent positions right away, there should be mandatory trial periods. During these periods, feedback should be gathered from all levels, what's known as a 360-degree review, before making any long-term commitments. Another important safeguard is to separate the power to propose actions from the power to approve them. When one person holds both, it creates a dangerous concentration of influence and opens the door to unchecked manipulation. To prevent groupthink and ensure critical decisions are well tested, organizations should also assign someone the formal role of devil's advocate. Their job is to challenge assumptions, question the leader, and make sure alternative perspectives are heard. And finally, implementing term limits and rotating leadership positions can help counteract the psychological decay that comes from holding on to power for too long. Power left unchecked tends to corrupt, and that's something Machiavelli understood better than most. Perhaps most importantly, Machiavelli's insights suggest we should focus less on individual leaders and more on institutional constraints. As he wrote, a prince, therefore, being compelled knowingly to adopt the beast, ought to choose the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Therefore, it is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares, and a lion to terrify the wolves. The fox represents strategic wisdom, the ability to detect deception and navigate complex social environments. The lion represents moral courage, the willingness to stand firm on ethical principles despite opposition. But perhaps the most important insight isn't about individual leaders at all, but about creating systems where even flawed leaders can produce good outcomes. What systems have you encountered that effectively prevent the worst leadership abuses? James Madison, one of America's founding fathers, understood this Machiavellian principle when designing the U.S. Constitution. He wrote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." Instead of seeking perfect leaders, Madison created a system of checks and balances designed to function even with imperfect, self-interested leaders. A truly Machiavellian solution in the best sense. Modern research in organizational psychology suggests that leadership effectiveness depends more on context than on individual leaders. The same person who thrives in one leadership role may fail in another, not because their character changes, but because different contexts reward different attributes. This suggests we should focus less on finding perfect leaders and more on creating systems that bring out the best in the leaders we have. We've explored why leadership so often rewards narcissists, liars, and fools. Not because these qualities make for good leadership, but because they provide advantages in leadership selection processes. We've seen how Machiavelli's insights from Renaissance Italy align remarkably well with modern psychological research on power, perception, and leadership dynamics. But we've also discovered exceptions to these patterns and potential solutions. The uncomfortable truth is that our leadership selection systems, whether in politics, business, or other domains, often select for the wrong traits. We reward confidence over competence, charisma over character, and decisive simplicity over thoughtful complexity. This happens not because we consciously prefer poor leaders, but because our psychological biases make us vulnerable to certain forms of influence and impression management. Machiavelli's most profound insight wasn't that the world rewards vice over virtue, but that effective leadership requires understanding human psychology as it is, not as we wish it to be. Many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in reality. For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. But understanding these dynamics is the first step toward changing them. We can implement selection processes that emphasize track records over performances. Past behavior predicts future behavior more reliably than interviews or debates, which reward theatrical skills over leadership capacity. We can create institutional safeguards that limit the damage narcissistic leaders can cause. Term limits, power-sharing arrangements, and strong accountability mechanisms can protect organizations even when flawed leaders emerge. Finally, we can educate ourselves about these psychological patterns. By understanding how narcissism, strategic deception, and false simplicity influence our perception of leadership, we become less susceptible to their appeal. We can learn to distinguish between genuine confidence and narcissistic self-promotion, between strategic communication and manipulative deception, between accessible simplicity and intellectual laziness. The truly Machiavellian leader, in the best sense of the term, sees through the games of power while maintaining a moral compass that points toward genuine human flourishing. And the truly Machiavellian citizen understands these dynamics well enough to select leaders who will serve the common good rather than their own grandiosity. What aspects of leadership selection have you seen backfire in your own experience? Have you ever encountered a leader who rose to power without falling into these darker patterns? I genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, or if you know someone whose position or perspective could really benefit from hearing this, consider sharing it with them. Sometimes the right insight at the right moment can shift how someone sees everything. If you found value in this exploration of leadership psychology, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden patterns that shape our world. Until next time, remember, in a world that rewards princes, be wise enough to see through the crown.